Welcome to the second lecture this week. Today's topic is the role of respect for cultural diversity and pluralism in bioethics. If you recall, in the first lecture, I was reflecting on the relation between our mother tongue languages and the kind of morality that characterizes each of us. All of us are absolutely sure that in our childhood we learned our mother tongue languages, but none of us remember how we learned it. Probably the kind of morality that defines each of us we learned in the same period we learned our mother tongue languages. So in addition to a mother tongue language, we also have a mother tongue morality. In today's lecture, we will reflect on what does it entail to respect cultural diversity and pluralism. How can we navigate in the world of different moralities, different moral traditions, millions of different mother tongue moralities? What does it entail to respect the morality of another citizen of the global village? Welcome to the second lecture. As you may record, the first lecture was on mother tongue languages and mother tongue moralities, where I tried to emphasize the fact that each of us, besides having a mother tongue language, each of us also are carriers of a mother tongue morality, the kind of morality that define each of us as moral beings. And this is a kind of morality that all of us learned probably in the same period we learned our mother tongue languages. We don't remember how we learned our mother tongue language, but we are absolutely sure that once upon a time, that is when we were small, young philosophers, we learned this language. And there are indications that the kind of morality that characterizes each of us, we learned in the same period we learned our mother tongue morality, mother tongue language. For this reason, all of us also have a mother tongue morality. But if this is a fact, then it becomes very important to address the issue of what does it entail to respect the moralities of other people. Does it mean that all morals are relative, or are there some universal standards that each of us need to observe and live in accordance with? In this second presentation or lecture, we are going to address this question, and within the context of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, because this declaration has one article about respect for cultural diversity and pluralism. So the question for this lecture is, what does the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights say about respect for cultural diversity? I will start with a brief history of the UN organization that is behind this declaration. It is UNESCO. UNESCO was founded in 1945 as the successor to the League of Nations International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation. So UNESCO is a specialist agency of the United Nations aimed at promoting world peace and security through international cooperation in education, the sciences, culture, and communication. UNESCO's headquarters is located in Paris, but it has regional, national, and cluster offices in all parts of the world. UNESCO has 6 official languages: Arab, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. So all the documents, all the normative documents issued or produced by UNESCO is possible to read in these 6 different languages. So to a brief history of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, to contextualize this article on respect for cultural diversity and pluralism. The acronym is UDBHR, Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. It is the first international declaration that links bioethics and human rights, and that step is extremely important. I will come back to that, why that is so important. The declaration is the only existing ethics declaration that has been adopted by all member states of the United Nations. This happened in October 2005, on October 7th, and all members of UNESCO, 192 member states, adopted by acclamation this declaration. That means countries from Togo, North Korea, the United States of America, Iceland, and Argentina adopted by acclamation this declaration, which in itself is a miracle when we talk about the normative history of ethical guidelines and declarations. Why is it a miracle? 2005 is just 4 years after the terrorist attack in the United States. And my conviction is that it would not have been possible for 192 member states to agree on this declaration if it had happened 5, 6 years later. In a way, in 2005, at least the world tried to come together. And then we know what has happened thereafter. It is also a miracle if we compare this declaration with other guidelines and declaration, which we will make use of in this course. For example, the Helsinki Declaration, which is a declaration issued and revised several times by the World Medical Association. In the World Medical Association, not all national medical associations are members. That means that behind the Declaration of Helsinki, there are not states. There are only some national medical associations. Take another important set of guidelines, the guidelines of SIOMS, that is the International Organization for Medical Sciences. Also, these guidelines do not have member states behind them, but are supported by some stakeholders. So the fact that we have finally, in 2005, a declaration that links bioethics and human rights, that we have a declaration that is supported by all the member states of the United Nations, that is a miracle. And that is also the reason why it is so important in this course to make use of this declaration. But before making use of it, it is so important to understand how it was created, what the different articles say, and how these articles should be interpreted. So first to the drafting process of the declaration. And again, to compare it with the Declaration of Helsinki, to compare it with the Science Guidelines, the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights went through a long and very wide-reaching process of being drafted. And I will divide this drafting process in 3 phases. The first phase lasted from October 2003 to April 2004, when the General Conference, every year, all member states meet in Paris to discuss policy issues relevant for UNESCO and also to decide on the budget. And this meeting is called the General Conference. And in October 2003, the General Conference considered that, and I quote, "it was timely and desirable to establish universal standards in the field of bioethics with due respect for human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms in the spirit of cultural pluralism inherent in bioethics." End of quote. Then there is the process from January 2004 to April 2004. First, there was consultations on the structure and objectives of the draft. There was wide consultation with member states, that is, with permanent delegations of UNESCO and national commissions, about the objectives, the scope, the structure, and the content of the declaration. And then there was an extraordinary session of IBC. IBC is the International Bioethics Committee that was set up by UNESCO in the 1990s. And in this session, this extraordinary session, 3 questions with regard to the draft declaration was raised. Should it only be focused on humans? What should be the fundamental principles? And should the declaration focus on particular areas or be a more general normative document? Phase 2 of the drafting process lasted from April 2004 to January 2005. The consultation process and the first draft of the declaration was made. There were 6 meetings of the working group behind the declaration. The working group consisted of members of the International Bioethics Committee. The International Bioethics Committee consists of 36 members selected from different parts of the world. Each member is then invited to become member of the committee, not as representatives of their countries, but as experts in bioethics, and they only refer, or they do not need to refer to their own governments. They represent themselves. Further, 2 meetings were held by the United Nations Interagency Committee on Bioethics to discuss this draft. Then followed regional and national consultations. And in August 2004, the International Bioethics Committee had its 11th ordinary session. And here they organized consultations with different religious and spiritual traditions to have their views on the draft declaration. Then from October to December 2004, written feedback on the 3rd draft were asked for and received. And on January 2005, the 3rd draft with the revisions were approved by the International Bioethics Committee. And then the last phase, the 3rd phase of the drafting process, which lasted from January to September 2005, the completion of the declaration. And the Committee of Government Experts was consulted, and also UNESCO's Executive Board discussed this draft. And then during the General Conference in October 2005, that is on October 7th, the declaration was adopted by acclamation of the General Conference. Let's then move to, okay, where did the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights takes its inspiration? What are the normative roots of this declaration? There are several roots. First, the fundamental principles of UNESCO as an organization. Since its establishment in 1945, UNESCO always, in all its normative documents, refers to respect for dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. So the declaration also is deeply connected to the international human rights system. And certainly, it also makes implicit reference to other international declarations, for example, the Nuremberg Code, which we will present and discuss during this course, the Declaration of Helsinki, which I have already mentioned and which we also will pay due respect to during this course, and other international instruments related to bioethics, for example, the Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine of the Council of Europe, which was issued in 1997, which also is labeled the Oviedo Convention, because the adoption of this convention took place in the Spanish town Oviedo. And finally, it takes also its inspiration from the European legal and ethical tradition, that is, the universalist vision or orientation, and with emphasis on also the importance of respecting cultural differences. We will come back to that in relation to Article 14 of this declaration. And I think most important, the most important root, so to speak, is Article 1 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. End of quote. This is not an empirical statement about the fact of the world. We know that all beings, empirically speaking, are not born free or are not equal in dignity and rights. It is a dramatic difference between being born, for example, in the city where Susanna and I live now, Oslo, and Mogadishu in an African country. But even in Oslo, one of the richest cities in the world, the difference in life expectancy between East and West is up to 12 years. But Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not an article stating empirical facts. Article 1 is a normative vision about every human being's right to be and do in her or his way. And that is what is expressed in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that every human being should be given the possibility to be in the way he or she wants, and to do, that is, to realize his or her capabilities in the way he or she wants. And that is what means to be born free and equal in terms of dignity and rights. Let's then move to the structure of the declaration. First, we have two articles under the heading General Provisions. And Article 1 is about the scope of this declaration. And I quote, "This declaration addresses ethical issues related to medicine, life sciences, and associated technologies as applied to human beings, taking into account their social, legal, and environmental dimensions. Furthermore, this declaration is addressed to states. As appropriate and relevant, it also provides guidance to decisions or practices of individuals, groups, communities, institutions, and corporations, public and private. And the second point is extremely important because the main addressee of this declaration is member states of the United Nations, although it also consider as addressees individuals, groups, communities, institutions, and corporations, public and private. But the fact that it is addressed first to states makes this declaration different from most other ethical guidelines and declarations. The European Convention of Biomedicine and Human Rights is similar because its main addressee is the member states of the European Council, but it is a European convention, while the declaration we are talking about now is a global declaration that all member states of the United Nations have adopted. The second article under the heading General Provisions talks about the aims of this declaration. And again, I will quote some of the most important phrases. First, to provide a universal framework of principles and procedures. And that universal aspiration is very, very important and is a very core characteristic of this declaration. Second, to guide the actions of individuals, groups, communities, institutions, and corporations, public and private. To promote respect for human dignity and protect human rights. Well, the fact that bioethics and human rights are linked together in this declaration makes it a declaration of, we could say, a double nature, that bioethics should be balanced with human rights. To recognize the importance of freedom of scientific research and the benefits derived from scientific and technological developments. Well, we are now living under this horrible pandemic, and we see how important the realization of this vision or this aim would be to recognize the importance of freedom of scientific research, and more important, that benefits derived from such research should be equally distributed. When we see now how the vaccine nationalism is impeding the just and fair distribution of vaccines, we see how far it is still to go and how important this aim of distributing the benefits of scientific and technological innovations in a just and fair way. To promote equitable access to medical, scientific, and technological developments, well, taking into account the present pandemic, we see how far it is still to go. To safeguard and promote the interests of the present and future generations, and to underline the importance of biodiversity and its conservation as a common concern of humankind. Just an observation here. It is a paradox that some of the cost poorest countries in the world are some of the richest countries in the world with regard to biodiversity. Maybe this represents some kind of poetic justice, because if these countries are given the possibility of exploring and exploiting its own biodiversity for the best benefit of their peoples, this will have a tremendous importance for the future of these countries, the future flourishing of these countries. Further about the structure, the declaration has 15 articles highlighting core ethical principles. That is articles 3 to 17. The first is on human dignity and human rights. The second, or Article 4, on benefit and harm. Article 5, autonomy and individual responsibility. Article 6, consent. Article 7, persons without the capacity to consent. Article 8, respect for human vulnerability and personal integrity. Article 9, privacy and confidentiality. Article 10, equality, justice, and equity. Article 11, non-discrimination and non-stigmatization. Article 12, sorry, I said Article 14 earlier in my presentation. Article 12, respect for cultural diversity and pluralism. Article 13, solidarity and cooperation. Article 14, social responsibility and health. Article 15, sharing of benefits. Article 16, protection of future generations. And 17, protection of the environment, the biosphere, and biodiversity. If we look at these articles, for example, Article 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, you find in most other international ethical guidelines and declarations. But for example, Article 13 on solidarity and cooperation was one article that was included in the declaration, not the least thanks to the work of bioethicists from Latin America. The same with regard to Article 14 on social responsibility and health. And Articles 16 and 17 are two articles that are much more visible in this declaration than in other ethical guidelines and declarations. Then two observations. The first observation linked to one question. It is important to keep in mind that none of the principles are given a contentful or exhaustive definition. Why is that the case? Well, here is a tentative answer. If we accept the plurality of moral languages and traditions, it will not be possible to reach full consensus on how to define each principle. And that, in a way, is what is coined in Article 12 on respect for cultural diversity and pluralism. We have to respect that there are a plurality of moral languages, as there is a plurality of mother tongue languages. And for this reason, we cannot reach an exhaustive definition, a contentful definition of each principle. Then consensus would not prevail. Second observation, the ordering of the 15 principles, that is the chronology in the declaration, does not reflect difference with regard to their importance. Each principle is equal in terms of normative status. Each principle is equal in terms of normative status. Then under the heading application of the principles, there are 4 articles. And here also the Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights differ from other ethical guidelines and declarations, because these articles says something about, okay, how should these principles be applied? The first article is on decision making and how to address bioethical issues. Article 19 is on ethics committees, and this is in a way a reiteration of a principle in the Declaration of Helsinki since 1975, that ethics committees, or in the Declaration of Helsinki, it was that research ethics committees, independent research ethics committees, should be established. The Article 19 of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights goes further because it encourages member states to establish ethics committees on different levels, and most important, to establish national bioethics committees. Then there is an article on risk assessment and management, and Article 21 on transnational practices. Then there are 4 other very important articles that talks about how this declaration should be promoted. Article 22 emphasizes the role of member states, and two activities are emphasized. First, the establishment of ethics committees on different levels. And second, as highlighted in Article 23, the implementation of bioethics education and training on different levels. Article 24 is an article of international cooperation, and Article 25 is about, okay, what role should now UNESCO as a UN agency play in the promotion of the declaration? UNESCO serves as a helper and advisor to member states when it comes to culture, education, the sciences, and communication. And in the declaration, Article 25, it is highlighted how UNESCO could assist member states in their endeavors to promote the declaration, and with particular emphasis on the establishment of independent ethics committees on different levels, and on the implementation of bioethics education, training, and information on different levels. Then there are 3 articles under the heading Final Provisions. And I will quote these articles because they are all particular importance. We are not now talking about the 15 principles. We are talking about Article 26, 27, 28 that concerns final provisions. And the first is on the interrelation and complementarity of the principles. And what is important with regard to these 3 articles, it tells something how the declaration should be used, how it should be interpreted. This declaration is to be understood as a whole, and the principles are to be understood as complementary and interrelated. Each principle is to be considered in the context of the other principles as appropriate and relevant in the circumstances. And here, Article 26 refers to the 15 principles that I showed here, the 15 articles under the headline principles. So this says something extremely important when it comes to making use of this declaration and interpreting each part of the declaration. Each principle should be considered in the context of the other principles, that is, in the context of the whole declaration. Article 27 on limitations on the application of the principles. And I quote, if the application of the principles of this declaration is to be limited, it should be by law, including laws in the interests of public safety for the investigation, detection, and prosecution of criminal offenses, for the protection of public health, or for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. Any such law needs to be consistent with international human rights law. And here again becomes clear why it is so important to remember that this bioethics declaration is rooted in international human rights law. Article 28 on denial of acts contrary to human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human dignity. And I quote again, nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any claim to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human dignity. End of quote. So now finally to Article 12, respect for cultural diversity and pluralism. And I quote, this is the wording of the article, the importance of cultural diversity and pluralism should be given due regard. However, such considerations are not to be invoked to infringe upon human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, nor upon the principles set out in this declaration, nor to limit their scope. So, what is said here is that to respect cultural diversity and pluralism is a moral obligation, but this respect has a limit. In the moment that such respect infringe upon human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, this respect is no longer warranted. So, three observations about how to understand this article. The article on the importance of cultural diversity and pluralism needs to be interpreted within the context of the whole declaration. And it stated due regard means that respect for cultural diversity and pluralism has to be in compliance with human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. For example, during the civil war in Afghanistan, when Taliban closed all primary schools for females, they tried to justify this with respect to their own culture. It was not normal in their culture that girls should go to school. Well, would it be in compliance with Article 12 of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights to respect the culture, this kind of cultural diversity? No, says Article 12. In the moment that such respect infringe upon human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedom, such respect has its limit. In other words, respect for cultural diversity and pluralism has its limits in the moment such respect implies negligence or complicity in human rights violations. Showing such respect represents not just a moral wrong, but a moral crime. So to my concluding remarks. As stated by the UNESCO General Conference in 2003, the right time had come, and I quote, to establish universal standards in the field of bioethics with due respect for human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, in the spirit of cultural pluralism inherent in bioethics. End of quote. First, one observation on the word, the right time. The ancient Greek word for that is kairos, and it means right timing. And I think the creation of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights choose exactly the right time, choose kairos. And I believe that it was because the negotiations, the drafting took place from 2003 to 2005, it was possible to reach global consensus on some universal standards in bioethics and human rights. But this declaration on bioethics and human rights represents only the first bold step towards realizing the visions set down in this declaration. And for this reason, it is so important, these 4 articles on the promotion of the declaration. The work has started, but there is a long, very, very long way to go. Thank you.